Hello and welcome to History Bubble and the second episode on where Europe was able to conquer and get ahead of most other regions in the world in recent centuries until now. In this episode we'll instead explore the more general trend in history of the Eurasian dominance over other continents. This will be done by exploring the book Guns, Germs and Steel and then general criticisms of the book.
The first part of this sub-series will explore the first half of the book, the second will cover the second half, and the third and last episode will cover criticism of the book, and counter-arguments by the author, and an overall summary. So Guns, Germs and Steel is a 1997 book by Jared Diamond which seeks to answer the question of, quote, why did wealth and power become distributed the way that they are, rather than in some other way? He feels this question is better answered by exploring the geography and ecology of the regions rather than the recent history. The reason for this is best explained by an example. While it's easy to say that the Europeans were able to defeat Native Americans because of their better technology, administration, and horses, this explanation does not say why the Europeans were better at those things, which can be explained by geography and ecology.
This outlook still has many problems, some of which Jared acknowledges and others will be explored in the fourth part of this series. To the problems of Eurocentrism, he says that he is not trying to justify what happened, instead trying to understand, and the book also focuses for the most part on regions outside of Europe, to further distance himself from the environmental determinism of the past, which is often used to support racist conclusions, saying that people were better by providing counter-arguments against these types of environmental determinism.
One of these older theories is that climate played a large part in shaping which country was most developed, which he discredits by saying that the most developed regions have been in very different climates and regions in different times. Others say that rivers suitable for irrigation was the reason for Eurasian dominance, but irrigation only followed more centralized societies, which usually formed in the highlands.
So, the history explored in this episode will mostly be concerned with events occurring before the rise, or even writing was invented, starting around 40,000 years ago, where the first likely evidence for boats is found.
The evidence for this comes from the colonization of Australia and the surrounding areas. At that time, this event was closely followed by the extinction of the continent's megafauna, except for the kangaroo. The probable reason for the megafauna extinction is that these species were not prepared for the humans' hunting prowess and did not feed them, which made them easy prey for the humans. The reason for this not happening in Africa or Eurasia is that it took tens of thousands of years for the humans to develop such a point to be a decent threat to the local megafauna, and the threat level increased gradually, which left time for the megafauna to adapt and feed them. Similar events also occurred in Siberia and Americas, where much of the local megafauna became extinct, especially those somewhat friendly to humans. Another theory for the megafauna extinction is climate change and ice ages, but there is a large problem with this theory. Quote, the Americas' big animals had already survived the ends of 22 previous ice ages. Why did most of them pick the 23rd to expire? In concert, in the presence of all those supposed harmless humans. We can see the environmental impact on historical development, especially when we're looking at isolated islands and Polynesia. Here we can see the largest or most connected islands were the most developed, with soil, fishing, fresh water and wildlife existed. Some of these islands also provide good examples of people abandoning good technology when the conditions are bad, such as many domesticated animals being abandoned on smaller islands and even agriculture on the colder ones. The difference of these environments is shown best by different developmental levels between Europe and Americas at the time of contact. And now less than 500 Europeans, with native allies, were able to defeat the largest empires in the continent. Even in the most fair battles in the Spanish Inca War, the Inca were defeated when having numbers over 10 to 1. The biggest factor was steel and horses available to the Spaniards, with guns, naval tech and writing being other important factors. Most of these factors which led to the success of the Spanish are indirect that hail from more underlying factors such as food production. He then underlines what he felt was the important factors for developing the agriculture: east-west access, suitable wild species, ease of spreading, domestication, food surplus, dense population, and technology.
The major reason why agriculture is so different between regions is because, quote, only a small minority animal and plant species are edible to humans or worth hunting or gathering. Most species are useless to us for food for one or more of the following reasons. They are indigestible like bark, poisonous like monarch butterflies and death-cap mushrooms, low in nutritional value like jellyfish, tedious to prepare like very small nuts, difficult to gather, larvae and most insects, or dangerous to hunt like rhinoceroses or hippopotamus. Most biomass, living biological matter, on land are in the form of wood and leaves, most of which we cannot digest. By selecting and growing those few species of plant and animals that we can eat, so they constitute 90% rather than 0.1% of the biomass on an acre of land, we obtain far more edible calories per acre.
The domestication of animals is similar, but even more restrictive, but also provide many benefits, since it's also a more efficient way of getting meats than hunting, and they also provide manure and plowing. Transportation and clothes can also be provided for by agriculture. The increased surplus also makes specialization possible, since each person no longer had to produce food.
If we look back in history, it's easy to see that different regions developed agriculture at different times, and quite fertile regions, such as the US East Coast and Southern Africa, did not have agriculture until fairly modern times. If we look back even further, many bread baskets of the modern world did not independently develop agriculture. This is while not so fertile regions, such as the Middle East, the Andes and the Sahel zone in Africa, did. Many regions also got agriculture only after having it introduced to them, such as Europe. Different regions also developed agriculture at radically different times.
There were very few places where food production were developed independently, and most places got it through diffusion. There are only 5 regions where it's certain food production rose independently, and 6 more where it probably did. The region where it was certain is the Middle East, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the Eastern USA, and where it's likely are the 2 different Chinese large rivers, the Sahel zone, Ethiopia, New Guinea, West Africa, and the Amazon. Most of these uncertain regions are certain to have mostly developed agriculture on their own, but might have had 1 or 2 species brought to them to start the process. Other regions, such as Europe, have of course domesticated their own species, but this was only after agriculture had come from the outside. But why did some people attempt agriculture, and why did they do it when they did? Hunter-gatherer lifestyle had more free time, was less physical, and corpses are often more nourished than early agriculturalists, and even most later ones. Some hunter-gatherers knew and traded with agriculturalists for a very long time, still did not start themselves, such as the Khoi, Californians, and Northern Australians. Some also waited for thousands of years before adapting, such as some Germans. So why did food production evolve? There's neither a sharp divide between sedentary agriculturalists and nomad hunter-gatherers, since it's also possible to affect and tend the land while not committing to agriculture. Because of this, it is often took thousands of years for agriculture to develop. Some possible reasons for developing agriculture are the diminishing returns of hunting, since hunting often slowly decreased population over time, tech and plant domestication becoming better over time, and human population density increasing, although this might be a question of whether population increased because more food was able to be produced, or that more food was needed as such, and as such, domestication became more important. The increased birth rate of agriculturalists explains how it could provide more food, but less well-fed people, with population density increasing more than production. While cereals also became more abundant when food production started in the Middle East, food producers were also denser and more organized, and were able to forcefully expand agriculture because of the larger population. So with all this, how were plants domesticated? Most species, as you are probably aware, look nothing like their current counterparts, being much smaller, less edible area, and some even being poisonous. Different plant species in the same regions were also domesticated at radically different times, some not even being domesticated today. To understand the domestication of plants, we first need to look on it from the plant's perspective, since the humans domesticating them did not understand the evolutionary biology driving the plants. For the plants, the most important thing for survival is the spread, and evolve in any way that would help this. And human domestication is one way they can do this. One way for the plant to spread by animal is to ripe, which means an animal will eat it and then leave a seed somewhere else with its feces. Some plants have developed genes only to be eaten by a specific species and thus often are passed poisonous to humans. These poisonous species can often mutate to become non-poisonous and then be planted and domesticated by humans. And many popular plants have wild poisonous ancestors, such as lima beans, watermelons, potatoes, eggplants, and cabbages. There are other species, such as the acorn, with similar properties that can have non-poisonous trees. But there is one crucial difference, that being that the poisonous properties of the acorn is determined by many genes, while that of, for example, cabbages is only determined by a few, making it much harder to breed out the poison of the acorn. Oiliness, fruitiness, and fibers are also factors that humans subconsciously choose for domestication, along with other plant-specific factors such as the gene that makes pea pod not explode. Most of these factors are bad in nature, and plants that have mutated into them will often die without offspring, were it not for the humans replanting their seeds. Other mutations often sought after in domesticated plants are regular growing cycle and self-pollination, both of which would be harmful in nature. The problem of growing cycles and plants starting to grow at different times, different years, can also be overcome by working the soil. Some of the first species to be domesticated, such as wheat and barley, have obvious benefits for domestication, such as they were easy to grow, with no special requirements, grew quickly, were abundant, easily stored, and there was little domestication needed as they're self-pollinating. Similar crops such as roots, legumes, and grasses were often domesticated first. Later, trees could also be domesticated, but only after agriculture had already been developed because of the high starting cost and long lifespan. But at first it was only trees that could be grown by seed or cuttling, and it was only later that fruit trees were able to be domesticated. The reason for this being that fruit trees cannot self-pollinate, which highly reduced the control humans had over their evolution, making it so a good tree can bring awful offspring. If instead of biological reasons for domestication of different species, there is a cultural theory claiming that it was instead the people who could choose to start agriculture or not, but there are many problems with this approach. First and biggest being that there existed thousands of different tribes over thousands of years in the same area with access to the same plants, and all of these having either slightly or largely different culture. Another factor is that there are so few plants that have ever been domesticated. Of roughly 400,000 plants, only a few thousand have been domesticated, and most only provide a small supplement, while a dozen provide 80 of all plant agriculture, these being the cereals wheat, corn, rice, barley, and sugar, the pulse soybean, the roots or tubers potato, manioc, and sweet potato, the sugar sources sugarcane and sugar beet, and the fruit banana. Only cereal crops accounts for 50% of plant production. Of these thousands, only very few have been domesticated in modern times with all the new knowledge of genes and evolutionary biology.
Because of all this, it's reasonable to assume that it has almost reached top domestication, at least without gene editing. Another problem with the cultural hypothesis is that hunter-gatherers are often more knowledgeable in plant than agriculturalists, making it more probable for them to have the culture to know how to domesticate. The problem comes with plants domesticated in some areas, but not others. A case of this is sugar, which was domesticated in the Sahel zone, but not in southern Africa, where it also existed, and was not introduced there for thousands of years. Other examples are flax in Europe and Africa, acorn wheat in the Balkans, which were some of the earliest to be domesticated in other regions of the world. There are many more examples of close relatives to domesticated species, but this reasoning is flawed for one big reason.
Quote, plant domestication is not a matter of hunter-gatherers domesticating a single plant and otherwise carrying on unshaped with a nomadic lifestyle. You need a lot of good plants to actually change from being a hunter-gatherer to an agriculturalist.
The question Diamond now tries to answer is, quote, how in short do you assess the potential of an entire local flora for domestication? If you look at the example of the Fertile Crescent, it is quite easy to see all the advantages.
They had such a good climate, big seeds without medial stalks, 6 out of 12 of the no major food resources. The plants had a large amount of food on them before domestication, self-pollination on many plants. Wheat and barley, which were the first major food crops domesticated in the regions, had basically every advantage possible in contrast to corn, the major food crop in the New World. Corn was small, hard to harvest, and took a long time to fully domesticate into the crop we know today. This comparison might explain why it took so much longer for agriculture to develop in the New World in contrast to the Middle East. If we instead try to compare the Fertile Crescent with other regions with the same climate, the reason for their success becomes even more apparent. The Middle East was larger, had 60% of the world's largest wide grasses, a large altitude variation, longer and wider rivers, domesticatable animals, and a larger climatic variation than the similar region in southwestern Australia, Chile, parts of the United States, and southern Africa.
The Middle East also had the largest starter package of domesticated plants, with 8 being domesticated at roughly the same time, making it a clear competitor to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. The life of hunter-gatherers was also becoming more and more difficult in the Fertile Crescent, as the once abundant animals' presence was ever decreasing, and with quite low gains outside of a few specific regions. We can also see that the first plants to be domesticated in each specific regions were often the best ones, so a comparison makes sense. Quote, "The first farmer used their detailed knowledge of local species to their own benefit, knowing far more about local plants than all but a handful of modern professional botanists. They would hardly have failed to cultivate any useful wild plant species that was comparably suitable for domestication. Another region would probably also start a food production, and comes up way too much in this book,
is New Guinea, the second largest island in the world. Here agriculture developed about 7,000 years ago, likely without outside influence, but the crops they domesticated had both low protein and calorie content, at least until they received the sweet potato from the New World. They neither had any domesticatable animals or cereal crops, which has become the staple food for early agriculturalists. Lastly, he also takes a look at the eastern United States. The starter package was mostly squash and a few other minor plants domesticated, which was not for a full conversion to an agriculturalist lifestyle, and it would take another 4,000 years for knotweed, maygrass, and little barley to be domesticated by 200 BC, making the agriculturalist way of life viable. These were decent food with high protein and decent oil content, but the seeds and food content was tiny, and some had minor poisons. It took another few centuries for corn and other Mexican crops to be introduced, and by 1000 AD these crops had almost fully replaced the old ones, and population boomed. But this was way too late to ever be able to compete with Europeans. With this example, it is clear that local crops have huge impact in the possibility of developing agriculture, and the places who did probably had a good reason for it. Diamond summarizes his argument and tries to answer the counter-arguments like, quote, "Naturally, I don't subscribe to the obvious fallacy that every society promptly adopts every innovation that would be useful for it. The fact is that over entire continents and other large areas containing hundreds of competing societies, some societies will be more open to innovation and some will be more resistant. The ones who do adopt new crops, livestock, and technology may thereby enable to nourish themselves better and to outbreed, displace, conquer, or kill of societies resisting innovation. That's an important phenomena whose manifestation extends far beyond the adoption of new crops."
He's also not trying to say that food production would never develop in these places, just that it is likely to develop them at different times. And with that, I will end this episode of History Bubble, and the next time we will continue to explore guns, germs, and steel, and focus on animal domestication and how food production indirectly affects every other facet of development between regions. And remember that this is heavily disputed or refuted in many scientific communities, and that there are many problems with a lot of the things stated here, most of which will be discussed in the third episode of this series, and the fourth in the larger series. Hope to see you then!